Welcome to More Perfect After Dark, where we take you behind the scenes to hear what we talk about after the official podcast ends. This week, we got into a wide-ranging discussion about European politics in the wake of the French election. We think you'll enjoy it. And we're out. Okay, so that's the first show.
I know, and I heard you swear too. That's kind of funny.
Yeah. So you know what we never got to this week? Our friends from Exxon who want to dig in Russia and hit oil and become rich, and the Trump Treasury has denied their petition. Anybody think that there's something diabolically clever in that?
No,
I think it's just Treasury being Treasury and saying no, we're not doing this. I don't think there's anything. It is a reminder that federal departments have their own priorities. The priorities may not necessarily be the same as other cabinet departments, let alone the president that oversees them. I tried to argue this during the whole Clinton email thing, that it wasn't about Republicans or Democrats. It was about the intelligence community versus the State Department. This is the Treasury Department versus the State Department, or anybody else for that matter. And this is the Treasury saying, nope, we said no, we meant it, sorry, go away. And maybe Exxon recruits the State Department and we have one of those great bureaucratic battles royale that everybody in Washington loves to see. We'll have to see if that actually happens.
Okay, so the big news this week was the French, not the big news, but the big news from France was the election that has led to a runoff between Emmanuel Macron and Marine Le Pen. I'm rooting for Macron.
In my office pool, I think I won this, and I actually saw it coming down to these two. Did you guys see this as headed towards this, or did you?
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's what I figured it too.
I thought there was an off chance that Mélenchon might knock his way in and we would be having a hilarious runoff, which was going to cause the rest of Europe to want to jump out of the window.
God, that would have been so... that would be the ultimate political car crash, but the French people looked at that and said, yeah, no, we want to at least give ourselves one chance to go off the cliff. We'd prefer going into a ditch. This is... If I were a French voter, this would be hard for me for a bit, because I think Le Pen is far better on Europe and the European Union than Macron is, but Macron is far better on everything else than Le Pen is. Right. And in the end, that would be enough for me. I would have to swallow hard and go for Macron, and hope something else busts up the EU. Oh, well, that's okay. I'll just wait 10 minutes. But
what about the shooting this week in Paris at the Champs-Élysées? Did you think that influenced a big turnout for Le Pen?
Not really.
Even though
I don't think so. I don't think it. I think it reinforced it reinforced for her voters what they want to do. I mean, she'd always been in the low 20s for the last several weeks. It did move her out of the low 20s. I think had she gotten up to say 30 or higher, then we would have said, okay, that definitely had an impact. I don't think it really had an impact on her vote. I think it just reinforced for her voters that, yes, we have to vote for her in their minds.
I think that something important to remember is terrorist incidents in Europe don't impact them in the same way because they do here, because they don't forget the same way we do here. So the memory of the November, 2015 attacks, I think is still very fresh in France. Brussels, London happening recently. When you live in that area of the world and travel between those countries is so frequent, it's akin to having a terrorist attack in Texas and then Oklahoma and then Florida a couple months later. It never leaves you. So I think that we don't see the collective amnesia over there that we see here.
Well, and the fact that you've basically had some ISIS affiliated nut crashing a car into something every few weeks.
Exactly.
It's sort of like shootings in Detroit. At some point, people stop noticing just because they're so commonplace. And I think ISIS is actually, as terrifying as it sounds in a sense, achieving a normalization of low-level terror attacks.
I'm going to disagree with you and push back, Cliff, on two things. one, analogizing them to shootings in Detroit. And now I can't remember what two was because I was so excited about one. So I'll just stick it to one.
Thank you, Rick Perry. Thank you, Rick Perry.
It's nothing. The way that Europeans, and I'm going to be like DJ and speak for all Europeans here, even though I have no, ability.
Oh, that never stops me.
Just kidding, DJ.
That never stops me.
Just kidding, DJ. Europeans don't view these terrorist attacks the way we view shootings in Detroit. There's a real problem in America, a race problem, that prevents us from viewing shootings in Detroit or Chicago as anything that affects us. And when I say us, I don't mean me, but I mean white intelligentsia America. There is a sense that you can self-select yourself or remove yourself out of the type of danger that shootings in Detroit creates in a way that you cannot do with terrorism. So the scar of terrorism and the memory of ISIS nut jobs running trucks into pedestrians on bridges is something that I think is paralyzing and very real and comes out in all elections in a way that Detroit.
And the other thing we have to remember, though, is, and this is something that I think is unique to France in a way that most people don't understand, is that when it comes to fighting Al-Qaeda and Daesh in, say, North Africa, France has really taken the lead in a way that no other European country has. And I think the French people are aware of this. So that whereas, I would certainly say, Europeans will not forget these attacks. They won't become, I don't know whether they become inured to them, but I think what the French people understand is that this is part of a war that they are fighting, that their government is fighting. And for all of the Hollande government's unpopularity, and Hollande is very unpopular, taking the fight to Daesh and to Al-Qaeda in northern Africa is not something that is unpopular in France. It is something that is popular in France.
And it's the history. It's the history of that country. Right. They've been there for forever. And they will look at this, and they will look at things like this, and they will say, and they will react to some extent the way British reacted to Irish Republican Army attacks. They will mourn the dead. They will say they don't forget them. They will not actually forget them, but they will all say to themselves, this is the price we are paying for sticking with the Ulster Unionists who do not want to leave our country. And I think in France, a lot of voters saying, this is the price we're paying for standing by our former colonies who have begged us for help and whom we are helping in defeating those terrorist forces. So it's not going to have the kind of impact that, say, it may be having in Germany, which is not used to colonies, which is not used to stretching itself outside of its borders as a force for good, because Germany has stretched itself outside its borders as a force for other things. So I think these things are more of a shock to Germany, which likes to think that it has sort of put dealing with the rest of the world in a military way behind them, and for good reason, as opposed to France, which says, this is part of the fight we have chosen, and we're continuing the fight.
Well, but even ejecting the Detroit analogy, there is the simple fact that over the last 50 years or so, you've had wave after wave of terrorist groups hitting Western Europe. You had the Red Army faction, you had the Basques, you had all the stuff going on in Italy back in the 70s and 80s. Where I think they had a cabinet minister who was kidnapped and killed. You had the IRA and so forth in Northern Ireland. So it's Western Europe has always had in recent history had its share of I'll say low grade terrorism. Nothing on the scale of the mass attacks that jarred everybody on back in 2005 when the trains got bombed.
7/7
London.
Yeah.
7/7 was unusual.
Yeah.
2007.
And DJ, I think the point you're raising is interesting, but I disagree to an extent. I think what you're talking about is the collective cultural memory of France, the nation state, right? That the extent to which their history of colonizing North Africa and really. Areas around there.
Go ahead.
Well, I don't think that the French people have that integrated into their immediate conscience, if that makes sense.
Right,
I don't think that they integrate with the threat.
I don't think it's a matter of them think. I don't think that the French people are looking about rebuilding the old French Empire. But I think the French people do understand that they have military forces in North Africa fighting terrorists. So that when the terrorists
but I don't think they connect that. I don't think they connect that to their history.
It's not a question of their history as much. I mean, I threw that in as sort of trying to show difference to Germany. My point is, when ISIS hits in France, in the French, I think for a lot of Frenchmen, it's like, well, this is part of the war we're fighting against them, and we've been fighting against them for a while. And I think for most Frenchmen and for most French citizens, that war is still worth it, no matter what ISIS does in response in France itself. And so I don't think it ends up, I don't think these attacks are shocks to them, and I don't think it's much a matter of Daesh normalizing it as much as it is the French people saying, this is war, c'est la guerre, but this is a war we're going to continue to fight, and we're going to have to keep expecting stuff like this. I think the French are a bit more mature in handling this than people realize, because most people don't realize how much they have actually been fighting this war in North Africa over the last few years.
Well, but I would respond, though, and say that in the case of France, there have been, and Western Europe in general, there have been several rounds of attacks which have actually jarred the populace. The attack on Charlie.
Oh, Charlie.
Yeah, the Charlie Hebdo attack. There is still a level of attack that can shock them, but it's very clear to me that what it takes to actually jar France is a lot more than what would be seen as jarring in the U.S.
No, I'm not so sure about that. I'm not so sure about that either. San Bernardino is fading from memory. Orlando is probably still there in memory. The guy who attacked a military recruitment in eastern Tennessee has been almost completely forgotten. The guy who tried to shoot Pamela Geller in Texas has almost been completely forgotten. We have our certain levels too.
The Fort Hood shooter.
And what's interesting by contrast? What's interesting by contrast is I think James Holmes has not been forgotten, right? Sandy Hook certainly hasn't been forgotten, right? These domestic acts of white male terrorism are much more at the forefront of the American conscience than these acts of, if we can say it here, Islamic terrorism.
Well, I still remember Columbine.
Right.
I want to try to bring the conversation back to the election and
sorry about
ask
that.
you guys.
Sure.
This was a nice, very fascinating diversion. But back to the election, I'm just curious as to where I'm not as well versed in European politics as certainly DJ is, Cliff is, and probably Helena and Greg as well. So I'm really wondering, where do you see this going and why? What is the balance now? I know that Macron is. What party is he from? I know he's not from the Labour Party.
Yeah, none of the above. His party is none of the above.
He created his own.
He is an ex-socialist.
He created his own middle of the road party. This is the first time that neither major party has made it to the second round. This would be the equivalent of the Republican and Democratic nominee finishing third and fifth in a presidential election. That's how much of a profound change that is.
Or could we say with some fairness that it would have been the equivalent of Donald Trump running against Bernie Sanders?
No, it doesn't ideologically line up.
Yeah.
Okay.
In terms of where Macron is and
Macron
where Le Pen is on the
centrist.
spectrum.
Ideologically, this would be the equivalent of Donald Trump running against Bill Clinton.
Yeah, that'd be about right.
So where do you see it going, considering the political environment in France and in Europe today?
Macron is going to win. I think he will win by somewhat less than the polls are showing now, but that somewhat is the margin tightening by 4 to 6 points. That is to say, Le Pen doing 3 or 4 points better than projected at the moment, partially because I think there's going to be some weird behavior among Mélenchon's voters, the far-left candidates' voters, where a decent number of them have been, at least anecdotally, saying either they're going to stay home, or some of them are going to saying, hey, I'd rather have Le Pen than Macron. Again, that is in line with your Sanders types, who you had some of them saying, I would rather have Trump than have Clinton.
Hillary. Yeah.
I think something interesting that you're seeing in this election is there's an additional axis that is dividing voters, and it's no longer just a left-right question, it's a globalization question. Are we going to be pro-EU or anti-EU? And so it's added a second dimension to French politics that really was not there, when Holland was in the running.
I would, what I would say, however, and I'm just going to challenge this because this has been a pet peeve of mine for years, if not decades. Pro-EU and pro-globalization are not necessarily the same thing. There are many of the EU critics who see it as a backwards and insular institution. And we'll get to that when we talk about the British election. I actually have been in communication with an American who is in France. I will not give his name at present because that could cause problems for his wife. And no, I'm serious. It's just there are various reasons I can't.
No. It's just
okay.
No. That's cool.
What they tell me is interesting, and that the concern they have is that one, Cliff's point about Mélenchon voters who will actually look at the EU as their issue and say, well, Le Pen is more Eurosceptic, so they'll vote for her. Also, they're worried about Francis Fillon's voters. Not necessarily going to Macron because, in the end, Fillon tried to adopt a very right-wing conservative platform to try to get himself into the runoff.
Right.
So, my source for what it is thinks that Le Pen could actually do much better than the polls are indicating. They're actually convinced that Le Pen could actually win the runoff. I don't think she will, but I think she's polling, Cliff, if I'm wrong, she's polling, somewhere in the mid-30s against Macron right now?
Yes, and my guess is she'll come in a bit over 40.
That's what I'm thinking too. I think she'll go in the low 40s. I don't see her getting above 45, but she could get to 45. Yeah. And then the real interesting one is going to be the elections for the parliamentary elections afterwards, because Macron basically created his party 2 years ago. Of course, Le Pen has the Front National. Neither is considered a quote-unquote mainstream party. The parliamentary elections are just going to be a complete mess over there. It'll be fascinating to watch.
Yes, I think that is definitely something I would agree with. And, I mean, one thing I will say is you have a lot of, I will say, pro-globalization voters. You have a lot of pro-globalization individuals who have issues with the EU because the EU, and I think you would agree with me on this, DJ, they have time and time again. The EU has time and time again failed to or refused to reform itself. Part of that is simply that its structures are set up so badly that it couldn't if it wanted to. But part of it is also that it doesn't want to.
Oh, agreed.
That these Eurocrats want to keep ruling from behind the scenes with a divided parliament.
Oh, absolutely. The European Union is, if I may, when I'm feeling kind to them, I call them post-democratic. When I'm not feeling kind to them, which is most of the time, I call it anti-democratic. It is an anti-democratic institution. It is a 1950s institution trying to get around in 2017. It is antiquated.
It's the Alliance from Serenity.
Yes, it is. It is the Union of Allied Planets in all its horrific dystopic glory. So, speaking of the European Union and those who wish to get away from it, one country that did vote to get away, the United Kingdom, was told that it's going to elect a new parliament 3 years ahead of schedule. In fact, it will do it next month on the 8th of June, unleashing what some of us think is the most fascinating reality show on Earth, a British general election.
All right. First of all, I don't know. A lot of our listeners don't understand that concept, and the thought that they can just call a general election, because I want to call a general election tomorrow in this country. I think this is brilliant. And if there was a law tomorrow, I would vote for it. Can you explain to our listeners how the snap election works?
Right. In this country, of course, elections are essentially determined by the Constitution. Congressional elections, presidential elections. There are no such limitations, or there were no such limitations in Great Britain until about 7 years ago. Normally, if a prime minister wanted to call an election, they could call it at any time. Or by contrast, if the House of Commons, which is the lower house of the British Parliament, basically, if a majority in the House of Commons said, we don't want you to be prime minister anymore, that majority could force an election at any time. In 2010, they passed something bizarre called the Fixed Term Parliament Act, which is supposed to try to prevent this thing from happening. It didn't. It was a damp squib. Basically, the Prime Minister, Theresa May, said, I want an election. The Fixed Term Parliament Act said she had to get permission from the House of Commons. Just about everybody in the House of Commons said, fine, we'll do this, for a whole host of different reasons. But in parliamentary systems, where the House of Commons reigns supreme, elections can basically be called at any time if a majority in the House of Commons, or if the Prime Minister, decides they want to hold an election, because there are no statutory limitations on elections, as there are here in this country. Now again, the British system is very different. The equivalent would be if the House of Representatives could elect Paul Ryan as President of the United States, pass legislation even if the Senate didn't want it to, by basically saying, no, you're going to enact this whether you want to or not, and then essentially tell the president that it has to sign whatever it passes, whether the president wants to or not. That's why the House of Commons is so important in Britain, because it is so much more powerful than the House of Representatives ever was over here, and that is why everyone pays attention to who gets elected to the House of Commons, because they determine the Prime Minister, and they essentially reign supreme in any legislative battles with the House of Lords, or even with Her Majesty the Queen herself.
What? Even the Queen?
Yes. The Queen is not supposed to veto any legislation that comes out of Parliament, although in reality she can, and there have been occasions where the Prime Minister, on at least a dozen occasions, this is true, the story in the Telegraph a few years ago, where the prime ministers of the time, normally it was Tony Blair, that bastard, would try to convince the Queen that, yes, you could veto that legislation because I don't really want it and I'm your prime minister. And usually the royal family's response was, what are you trying to do to us, man?
Your majority passed this bill.
Yeah, exactly. Your majority passed this. Shut up and take your medicine. But yeah, it's very different than it is here. House of Commons is much more powerful. That's why this is the most important election in Great Britain. And, oh man, is it a lot of fun to watch. Oh!
All right, so
yeah.
why is Theresa... I know the answer, but for our listening audience, why is Theresa May doing
because
this?
she can get a lot more conservative MP, and her party is the Conservative Party, or Tory for short. She can get a lot more Tories elected to Parliament than she has now. In theory, she has more than everybody else combined, but the margin's only like about 10. She only has 10 more than everybody else. She wants to get more than that. She wants a bigger majority, and if the polls are any indication, and be careful about that, I'll get into why the polls are an issue. If the polls are any indication, she will get a much larger majority, maybe 60, 70, 80, 90, even 100, and she can be in a command position to do what she wants in terms of getting Great Britain and Northern Ireland out of the European Union. She doesn't have to be held hostage to 24 of her own MPs who can basically say, no, I'm not going to support that, and grind her government to a halt. If she's got a majority of 90 to 100 or even 60 or 70, she's in a much more powerful position as Prime Minister.
The other thing that I think is playing a significant role here is the simple fact that the Brexit negotiations are going to be long, they are going to be ugly, and there's always a chance that you get a quote-unquote bad outcome to them, i.e. Britain leaving the EU without some sort of trade deal in place, the EU trying to, threatening sanctions if they don't pay £50 billion in an exit fee, etc., etc. Right. So doing this now gives her the ability to get a stable majority that will last for 5 years, rather than being potentially at the mercy of a slim majority that could be by-electioned away.
Okay. Now we've talked about the Tories, who because I'm a huge Labour, and I think all Tories are bastard people.
Well, you must be going through
they
some
are
pains, Greg.
And I think I said
nice
it the correct British way. They're complete. What's that, Cliff? I'm sorry.
You must be going through some labor pains over there, then.
Oh, yes. Does Jeremy Corbyn, who's head of Labour right now, does he have any chance whatsoever? Okay. Personally, I would love to see him, but I don't think he does.
Well,
what
Greg,
do you guys
that makes
think?
one of you. But this should surprise nobody that I am a Eurosceptic Tory sympathizer. But the one thing I will throw a huge caution on is these polls that show the Conservatives 15, 20 points ahead. British polling has a very unusual convention in that they don't count undecided voters. They know they're there, they list them in their tables and such, but then when they talk about who's going to vote what, they claim to assume that undecided voters will either vote the same way decided voters are voting, or they'll say, well, they're going to vote the way they voted in 2015 in the last election. Neither assumption may necessarily hold, and it leaves the British election system vulnerable to results that have nothing to do with polling, such as what happened in 2015, when poll after poll after poll after poll said the Tories and Labour were level, which is even with each other, and on election day the Tories had a 6-point lead in the popular vote and got a majority nobody expected. Because...
Or with the Brexit referendum.
Well, that's the Brexit. A number of the Brexit referendum polls showed that Brexit would lose by about 3 to 4 points, and they did the same thing. They dropped the undecided votes and said, well, they're going to vote the same way decided voters do. It's part of what Britain needs to do to sort of turn poll projections into seat projections for the House of Commons, because that's what's so important to them. If the House of Representatives were as important to us, we might have the same problem as, oh God, how do we project undecided voters so that people can understand what kind of future government they're going to see? But it leaves them vulnerable to swings and shocks and things that pollsters don't read. So you could have a situation where a bunch of undecided voters could say, you know what, I'm going to stick 2 fingers to this whole Brexit thing. 2 fingers is the British version for the middle finger, by the way. And we're going to vote all for the Lib Dems. You could see a bunch of tactical voting where anti-Tory voters go for the Lib Dems here or go for Labour there. You could see tactical voting against the Scottish National Party in Scotland where folks say, okay, I'm going to vote Tory here, I'm going to vote Labour there. If Theresa May does not get a majority in the House of Commons, I would say then it is quite, well, if she gets maybe short of 310, a majority would be 326, because there's the Ulster Unionists to worry about. But if she can't get a majority with the Ulster Unionists, or if she can't get a majority on her own, it is very possible that Jeremy Corbyn could cobble together the Scottish Nationalists and the Liberal Democrats, come up with some agreement where, not necessarily a full-blown coalition, but something that says, okay, you guys vote for me on budget matters and and what are called confidence motion matters. Basically, you will never throw me out of office as Prime Minister. And yes, Jeremy Corbyn could be Prime Minister under that scenario. And the ironic thing is, even though no poll is saying that's happening, in order to get maximum Conservative turnout, Theresa May and her people will scare every single British voter into trying to believe what they know in their heart is not true, which is that Jeremy Corbyn actually has a shot at being Prime Minister. That's one of the hilarious things about this campaign.
What I would also say there is I see a very thin chance of Corbyn ever being Prime Minister for more than a few days, if only because you've had so many Labour MPs who are opposed to him that I've mused about the possibility that even though they couldn't dislodge Corbyn as leader of the party, if you somehow got a Labour blowout, I have no idea how that could happen under present circumstances, but you could actually have a situation where anti-Corbyn Labourites had a majority in the Commons just because of how messed up Labour is. They're a soup sandwich right now. One thing to note about Corbyn is that last year, something like 170 of his MPs voted against him in a confidence motion, whereas only about 40 voted for him.
They tried to get him out as Labour leader.
The party then determined that, well, because he's the incumbent leader, he has the automatic right to stand in the resulting leadership election, and he won, and he is essentially leading a parliamentary party that 3/4 of them don't like him.
Well, the good news for him is that 24 of them have already stood down, and the rest are probably going to get wiped out in the Tory landslide. So the ones who survive may be more amenable to him. But yeah, and that's actually a new thing with party leaders in the UK. Traditionally, if the parliamentary caucus wanted you gone, you were gone. They have changed it since then, where if the parliamentary caucus wants you gone, at least in the Labour side, it has to be ratified by the party membership, and Labour Party membership said, no, we want to keep Jeremy Corbyn. The Conservatives have no such... The Conservatives let the party membership decide who the leader is, but when it comes to should the party leader remain, that is all within the realm of the Tory caucus. They can knife whatever leader they want to. But Labour has a different sort of setup. I'm... At this point, from what I've heard, is half the reason that Labour MPs were so eager to go to an election was they were hoping they could survive it, and two, they were hoping that it would be such a blowout that Jeremy Corbyn would finally step down as leader and see the writing on the wall. Whether that happens or not is an entirely different story. We actually have to have the election first. But, just as fascinating as all this is what happens in Scotland, where you have the pro-independent Scottish National Party, who won nearly every seat in 2015, and who just about everyone assumed until yesterday would win every single seat in almost every single seat in 2017. There are now polls coming out of Scotland that say the Nats could lose anywhere from 8 to 12 seats to the Conservatives, who were considered. 10 years ago, I would probably get more votes as an American than a Conservative running in Scotland. But Ruth Davidson has done an incredible job rescuing the party north of Hadrian's Wall, and she has really turned it into a serious force, and it could be a force that completely messes up the SNP's plans for an independent Scotland. And that's just another angle that hardly anybody is talking about here.
Yeah, the Scotland situation is fascinating because what you've seen is basically a unionist/separatist cleavage take over. And so you've seen Labour's vote collapse. In some polls, they've lost half their support to the Tories.
Yep.
Because simply, the issues have shifted, and the main issue up there is: do you want to remain in the UK or not?
Yeah. Yeah, Ruth Davidson stood behind a gigantic poster, and it basically said, "We said no, we meant it." She made no secret of what she's trying to do. So, and this is something that when June 8th actually comes around, and this is something else that most of our listeners probably don't know, the Brits don't do elections the way we do. They don't, we don't, what we do is the results go into centralized electoral boards. They put it up on their computers. We have to see scrolling at the bottom of our TV screens and everything else. And that's all wonderful. And that's, that's great technology and all. But what the British do is they have their counts in all 650 constituencies. That's what they call districts over there. And when the count is over, they get all the candidates on stage and they read out the names and the numbers of each individual ones on paper in front of a camera for all to see. And you get to see the candidates' reactions and such. The one I will never forget was, it was about midnight our time, 5 in the morning over there, when the Twickenham result was being announced. And Vince Cable, who had represented that seat for 18 years and was in cabinet part of the coalition, had been defeated by her Tory opponent. And you can actually see Tanya Mathias, who was the winning candidate, when her name was read out and it was said that she had more votes than Cable, she won the seat, she looked like she was going to have a heart attack. And she won! She was like, oh my God, I won. And I was saying that too, and I'm, 5 time zones away, but of course, I did, my whole life didn't just turned upside down. It's a fascinating part of the way the Brits do things that we just don't have over here, and it's wonderful, I think.
Oh, I think it's great. It's, first of all, you'll sign me up anytime there's a chance for public humiliation.
Greg, I didn't know you were into that.
Any chance. And not only that, but it's a little bit more real. Anytime someone runs for office, they know what they're getting into. So, and you don't get that whole, yes, maybe I'll concede, maybe I won't. No. Here are the numbers. You know what? Sorry. Thanks for playing. You lost. Here's the winners. Now we're going to play you off stage. You get the sash. You get the tiara. You get a box of rice-a-roni. Goodbye. And a home set and a home play version. Yes, thank you very much, and a hearty handshake. I love that. And you should actually set your DVRs to watch it. What I'm trying to remember.
Usually for those
channel?
of you who wish to watch it and who will not be at my election watching party, because I don't know any of you folks in listener land, my apologies. C-SPAN usually has BBC coverage starting at about just short of 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, because it's 10 o'clock British time when it shuts down. The first results usually don't get started till about 6 or 7 o'clock our time, and usually they are in very safe seats for one party or another. Usually the very safe seats in Sunderland come in. And then, Orkney will come in, which is usually a very safe Liberal Democrat seat, and up in Scotland. I'm trying to remember usually when the first safe Tory seat comes in. It's usually somewhere in the southwest. It used to be Torbay, and they maybe redraw it got big or something. But you also see the BBC also has, and now it's joint with ITN and all the other ones, they have an exit poll that they release at 10 o'clock that gives the initial forecast of how the seats are going to go. That was the first indication last time that the election was not going to be anything like what the opinion poll said. And at one point, Paddy Ashton, who was the leader of the Liberal Democrats back in the 80s,
I'll eat my hat.
He said famously, "Andrew, if this exit poll is right, I will publicly eat my hat on your program." It basically set the tone of the night until Alistair Campbell promised to eat his kilt, which actually scared the hell out of a lot of people for a bunch of reasons. But even before the first results are out, that you get folks commenting on it, and its partisans were commenting one way or the other, and it really is a sight to see. And for political junkies, it's wonderful. There is really nothing like it.
It's a lot more fun, I think, than the American, where you just see like ballrooms and like, and here's Senator such and such's ballroom, and here's such and such, and here's this viewing party, and
none of that.
And here's
none of that. It's people in school auditoriums and in some churches, but usually school auditoriums and community centers, reading out numbers and polls just things of it. And the first time I went through this was watching one of these all the way through was the British election in 1997, which was Tony Blair's first landslide. And as a conservative sympathizer, I'm watching all my candidates lose, and yes, that was painful, but it was still enjoyable to watch the give and take and everything back and forth. I mean, I'll never forget when the Conservatives won their second seat about 8 o'clock in the evening, and Lord Cecil Parkin said, "Oh, well, finally we know we'll have a leadership contest." I mean, it's hilarious. That's the kind of stuff you get watching election nights in Britain. They're just fascinating that way. And if you're really into this, and if you want to get an idea of kind of what it's like, Britain is actually having local elections next Thursday. You'll have to go on BBC and stream that.
2 weeks.
Next Thursday. Yeah, I meant Thursday next, not Thursday upcoming. It's the 3rd of May, or the 4th of May.
It's how the British say it. They say Thursday next.
Yeah, Thursday next.
We're getting him.
I know. I my language.
It's in a fortnight. How's that?
That's good. Usually when I talk about this, my language completely de-Americanizes. But you'll have to probably stream it on BBC News or Sky News. But that'll give you an idea. Those are local elections in England and in Scotland. But that'll give you an idea of how these sorts of things work. Not in terms of the results necessarily, because they'll all come in all over the place, but in terms of how the punditry works and how they like to argue with each other and some of the crazy stuff that falls out of their mouths. It's really, really fun.
Well, thank you for listening, and please follow us on Twitter at MPU Podcast and on Facebook at facebook.com/More Perfect Union Podcast, and share our link on your Facebook timeline so your friends can discover us as well. All your British friends, of course. Also, remember to check out the midweek More Perfect After Dark, which you just listened to. Kevin, are you there?
Yeah, I just snoozed a little bit when the Tories were beating the Whigs or wearing wigs or whatever.